The paper started from a puzzle about social media and politics. And it started from all of this literature that we find that shows that there are a lot of links between social media use and political participation, particularly among young people. And these very large studies have shown how people who use social media more tend to also participate in politics, that is to vote, but also to discuss about politics with their friends and families, for example. So they tend to do more political activities, not just voting. And there are other studies that show that there is a correlation between using social media and the number of people who use social media and internet and the frequency of protests, particularly in countries without a free press, apparently, but this is a bit less clear. And the reasoning behind this link between social media and politics is in part because social media offer access to more independent sources of information. That's one of the arguments. And the other one is it's because it gives the opportunities to discuss these questions and to connect with others. So that's the start on social media and politics. But then there is another part of literature that studies how states try to control internet and social media across the world, in both more democratic countries and in more authoritarian countries as well. So it's not just about autocracies and it's also about democracies. And this literature has pointed out, be careful, there is censorship and control. And also it started by really digging into what kinds of control exist of social media activities. But what we know a lot less about is what are the effects of these control mechanisms on the use of social media and on the political participation after that. And so that gave the start to this research question about how regimes or state control of social media affect how African young people use social media to get information. And it was the starting question. And what we know about young people across the continent and social media and censorship is, in a way, very important, and in another way, still limited. So when you take data from the World Bank and measurement data about how many people use internet and social media, it still seems to be very limited in Africa. But the thing here, I think you know, but this type of data is very patchy, it's not very good, and the way they measure isn't always very representative of what people actually do. But we also know that it's become a very important tool for political campaigns, for example, and also for participating in protests or for organizing protests. And there are also studies that show that the African young people who use internet and social media are better informed than those who do not use these sources. And the last aspect that's really important about this is that when we talk about state controls and how it applies, how African states try to control online activities, it's a lot about shutting down internet, but it doesn't really take into account other ways of controlling these. And I'll go a bit deeper in all of these aspects now. So there is a large literature on controlling social media, and it developed based on studying China and Russia, but it's also studied other countries and other continents, including Europe, but also including the African continent. And to summarize quickly this type of literature, there are 4 main ways to control online activities and specifically on social media. And the first one is shutting down access to internet and also limiting access to content using filtering. I'm not sure if you would. So for example, filtering, it means that a web page is not accessible from where you are. Or a social media profile would be available if you're in the US, but not if you're in another country, for example. Then there are what they call offline restrictions. And this is a good example of this. I mentioned taxation here. So in Uganda, in between 2018 and 2021, there was a tax on using social media, which meant that it was very expensive to access social media because you had to pay some money every day to be able to use social media on your phone. Then there is another type of control, which is surveillance. So it's about the state observing what happens online and monitoring what people do. And then there is what is called in the theory work, it's called flooding. It's about disinformation campaign. So a state who wants to control what's happening on social media can do so by producing a lot of content. That will mean that you won't see other types of content that the state doesn't want you to see. And the very important thing, we have all of these typologies, but these different forms of control, they are very often combined. So you have maybe a shutdown during an election, as was the case in Uganda, but you also have this taxation in place. And maybe the state monitors activities online as well. So you see, it's very rare or unheard of that you have only one aspect happening at any given time. Usually it's you do as much states that want to control online activities, they deploy more methods at the same time. And so there is also an emerging literature on the effect of these types of controls on what people do online and on offline activities also. And here, summarized, and what we can see is that some of these forms of controls I presented, they are very overt. That is, they are very visible and everyone experiences them. And it's the examples of the tax I mentioned or of shutting down internet. Everybody knows it's being shut down. So it's kind of a collective experience and it's very direct. And some case studies have shown that this can lead to a kind of backlash effect. So for example, the work of, for example, I think it's in Burundi, WhatsApp was shut down so the government made it difficult or impossible to access WhatsApp from a phone or for a Wi-Fi connection. But this led to people in Burundi learning how to download a VPN. So it's a program that makes it look like you're in a different country. So they learned quickly to use WhatsApp anyway. And that's what we call a backlash effect in these theories. So it's this idea that because the state tries to limit what you can access online, you have more motivation to go and find it. And then other forms of control, they are what I call covert. So they are difficult to detect. For example, if a website is not available to you where you are, but is available in a different country, unless you check regularly and try to see and to use the VPN, for example, to know that it's forbidden access, you're unlikely to be aware of it. And it's a bit the same with disinformation. It's not always very visible. But then you don't expect an effect, of course, because if it's not visible, you don't expect anything will happen. Like you expect it will change what people see online and what they think maybe, but it won't change how they act directly. They won't react to this. But then, of course, one of the interesting things is that these covert controls, they can become more visible. For example, if disinformation campaign, if they are very, very obvious, they can be some form of propaganda we could call hot propaganda, where it's so in your face that you know that's what's happening. But also another example that's a little bit different, but it's the arrests of high-profile activists. So if you arrest activists who are active politically, maybe demonstrate, but are not the main person in the group, that usually is not very visible. It's a hard fight to make it known that someone was arrested. But if it's a high-profile individual, then it can be seen by the other citizens. And these two examples, so these types of more limited visibility of controls, they can have what we call chilling effects. And chilling effects, it means that people are aware that there is censorship happening, but instead of going against it and being more interested in doing these forbidden activities, they will actually stop doing them. So that's the two strands of literature. They advance these two ideas. But what does that mean for young people? So there is quite a lot of literature, specifically from African scholars, and including Simba here, and focusing on different types of different African countries, that show that social media are really an important facilitator of young people's political activities, including to get the news. So it means that when it's shut down, it has a lot of impact for the people. And the other aspect that I was very intrigued by is there is a small literature that says that young people are more rebellious in a way. So they are the ones who play an important role in protest movements. And therefore, if you shut down their access to social media, they are the ones who use it the most, so they should be more impacted. And they are the ones who protest more, so you expect more backlash. And this is what led to those two hypotheses. The first one is that overt controls, and here I mean social media shutdown, they are linked, they are positively associated with using social media for news more. The idea here is that countries that shut down access to social media for a short period of time, they are more likely to see people use social media to get the news than countries that don't shut down social media. It's this backlash idea. And then the second hypothesis I have here is that this link, so more shutdown, more use of social media for news, is stronger for younger people because they are the ones who are more impacted. And then I wanted to go and see if it's verified when I use data, and that's where I used quantitative methods to do so. So what I'm measuring is how often people use social media to get the news using Afrobarometer data. So the data from the Afrobarometer, it's freely available. You can download it. I used this round from that was run in 2016, 2017, but now there are more rounds. So you have more recent data. And here the graph shows the percentage of people who use social media every day. It's in dark blue to never in light blue in different countries. And that's the dependent variable. So we're measuring so this is how we measure using social media for news in this paper. But then censorship of social media is measured at the country level. So for the 34 countries here from the Afrobarometer, I got data that's also freely available online. So it's from the Digital Society Project via VDEM, Varieties of Democracy. So what it is, the important measurement is this first one about social media shutdown. And what it is, it's experts who give code countries for every year to see if there are a lot of social media shutdown or not. So what you can see is that they give a rating in a way. And it's what VDEM does is they take ratings by at least 5 experts, and then they use an equation to make a measurement level to give it a grade. And you can see that the countries in this study, the ones who shut down social media the least, they were graded minus 1.68. And the ones who shut down social media the most, they were graded 2.553. So it gives you an overview. And the higher measurement means a lot of social media shutdowns, and the lower measurement means less. So that's the main independent variable. So I'm interested in how social media shutdown impact using social media for news. And then we have a lot of control variables. So I explained that in theory, that states are likely to use different types of control at the same time. And that's why I control for filtering of social media, monitoring, so that would be surveillance, propaganda, so when states use social media to do some propaganda, but also how often they shut down internet. And then I have other measurements that are also relevant. One of them is about the level of freedom of expression and access to alternative information sources. And it's measured the same way. Whether there was an election, the year of the study, so the year when the Afrobarometer question was asked, the percentage of people who have access to internet, and the GDP. That's the kind of variables I use to make sure what I'm measuring is the effect of social media shutdown and not these other aspects. And because I'm interested in what happens at the country level, so shutting down social media, it's measured at the level of the country, but I'm interested in this and its effect on the individual level. So what every person responding to the Afrobarometer says they do about using social media for news. And so I also need control variables at the level of those individuals. And we know that using social media is very often affected by, so I'm interested in age first and foremost, but we also know using social media is affected by living conditions, by the levels of education, by whether you, and we also control for other types of news sources, because another idea is if social media is shut down, then you're more likely to use the radio or TV, newspapers. And we also control for whether respondents discuss politics frequently. And the last question that I use from the Afrobarometer and that I think is very interesting is when the Afrobarometer asks the question, they ask individuals who they think sent the survey. So Afrobarometer is independent. So the correct answer, it's an independent survey. But they also ask, this to check if the respondent is aware of, might think he's being under surveillance, for example. And that's what we check for here. It's because I'm studying censorship. And so, of course, when you study censorship, you want to be sure to evaluate if the person who answers to you thinks you're from the government who censors, it might affect their response. And these are the results. I'll explain it. But what I've done is using what we call multi-level regressions. So it's a statistical method that takes into account the individuals as a group. So for example, all the people from Benin are considered together as people in Benin affected by shutdown levels. And we do this for all countries. And it's an equation. So here the result shows you the result for the whole regression analysis. And I'll explain what we see in the pictures. And it's easiest to look at it with the third and the fourth models, because the first one is the different types of measurement. But what you see at the bottom, the x-axis, is the level of shutdown in the countries. So you can see it goes more or less from -1 to +3. And in the y-axis, it's whether people use social media for news. And the shape of the curve is also, and the three curves is by age categories. So the model 2 here, you see the age of the people with this middle line. It's the mean age of all the people who answered to the Afrobarometer. And you can see that the more there are shutdowns on the x-axis, the more they use social media for news. But then you ask what happens to the younger people. And it's this lighter curve here. It's the -1 is -1 standard deviation. So it's a way to see you have the mean, and then you have all the people that are a bit younger. And we see they also use social media for news less, but it's more when there is shutdown, but it's a more straight line. It doesn't go up very much. And the darker line is for the older generations, the older people. And you can see that it spikes up much more. And that's what we see with this third model. I take the respondents, but here I say one group, we have the youth group under 35, and we have the older group above 35 years old. And you see here, it's the same as the first model. The ones who are 34, under 35, basically, they use social media more with more shutdowns in a kind of straight line. And the ones that are above 35 you can really see they use it even more. The difference between no shutdown and a lot of shutdown is very high. And the curve to the right, it's the same principle, but it's specified a little bit differently, with the people who are under 25 here, or 25 or under, those that are 26 to 34, I think, and here more than 35. So clearly, what we see is that my first hypothesis, when there is more shutdown, people use social media more, is correct. But my second hypothesis, which was that it's a stronger relationship for younger people, is not correct. We see a stronger relationship for the older people here. And I was very surprised by these results. And here you have the statistical table that doesn't tell you very much more than this curve gave you. The only thing I would show you that I found interesting is this surveillance measurement here. And we can see that it's significant, so it's those stars, but it's also negative, which means that when there is shutdown, people use social media more. But if you look at surveillance, it seems people use social media less when there is surveillance by the state. And one interpretation is to say, so citizens might be aware that there is surveillance ongoing. So I thought it was an invisible way of controlling social media, but it might not be that invisible. And it's what I would say in the discussion now. With these results, it's a first attempt to evaluate the impact of shutting down social media on using social media for news. But these statistical methods I've used, they can tell you about a strong correlation, but they don't really say it's the cause. Basically, the opposite explanation would be, and I've heard it a lot, but Pauline, obviously, you shut down social media when you're a country if your citizens use social media. And that's correct. And that's why we had all of these control variables, including the surveillance one. And that's why I think the relationship is important and my finding holds true. It's because, yes, you could say the opposite is true, but then you wouldn't expect this surveillance to have a different relation. So you saw the surveillance was, the more there was surveillance, the less people use social media. So if the relationship is the opposite, a state uses a form of control because citizens use it a lot, you should see more surveillance for people use social media more, and that's not what we see. Then a second point of discussion based on these curves that shows the difference between age groups. We need to remember that digital natives, so the younger people, can also be strangers to digital technologies. It's not because you're young that you use social media. You're more likely to use social media, but it comes at a cost. And it can be too expensive. So you use it less than people who are older, have a job, have a good salary, and can pay for it, especially when you need to use expensive tools like a VPN to access social media during a shutdown, for example. And also these findings, they show that we need to do more to understand how people perceive censorship and manipulation. So the research I've done is about what do we see states doing and how can it be related to what citizens do, but it's not about what citizens themselves perceive the state is doing. So that should be the next thing to be doing, basically. That was my presentation. I hope I made it understandable. I would be very happy if you have questions to answer them.
Thank you very much, Pauline, for that insightful presentation. And no wonder why it's an award-winning paper. Very, very insightful. This is an award-winning paper. Pardon? Yeah, no, it's, you can hear me, Pauline, right?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so I was just telling my students here that this is an award-winning paper, which was done on youth and social media and political participation. So you can actually see that it's very very insightful. I know some of the things that Pauline was presenting we've not yet covered in terms of like, of course, levels of significance and levels of measurement that is highlighted in that paper. But yeah, I gave these guys the paper last week, so I'm sure they should have 1 or 2 questions. And then I'll also maybe have 1 or 2 questions for us to discuss. So I don't know who would want to start. I will start with you guys. Those online as well, if you have any questions, you are also free to just raise your hand, and then we'll be able to take your question. Or maybe I can throw in my first question as these guys are preparing. I think you highlighted, Pauline, that you had a surprising finding in Uganda that you expected young people to be more active on online, on social media, especially after a shutdown. But unfortunately, it was the opposite, that the people that were actually active were the relatively older ones. So I just wanted to understand your thinking and your reflection around that. Could it be because of the introduction of the social media techs that made maybe data more expensive for young people to be active online? Or was there any like difference of usage of social media during maybe a shutdown before the introduction of the social media techs and after the introduction of the social media techs?
So it's an interesting question. So the findings, they show that young people still use social media more, but the you saw on the curves, the younger people still use social media more. But when you look at the after censorship, the difference between the no censorship and high censorship is stronger for the older generations. So it means that young people use social media more also after a shutdown, but older people use it. They learn to use it after a shutdown even more, in a way. So one of the explanations, if you understand, so it would mean that generally more young people use social media, and when there is a shutdown, they also increase their use, but the effect is bigger for older people. So I think a potential explanation for this is what I was saying about the cost. So we forget sometimes that it's very expensive to access social media, and therefore it can explain part of this. Another reason can be that because old people at the baseline, they use social media less, there is more potential for increased use. It's a bit like, it's maybe not they use it more, it's they start using it because there is a shutdown. And that's why we see this surprising effect of older people using social media even more to get the news. And then another dimension and possible explanation is that maybe older people use social media to get the news, and younger people don't get the news from social media. They use social media more, but maybe not for the news. That's the other dimension that would need to be explored.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I don't know. Yes, I think we have a hand online. Melania, you can go ahead.
Good afternoon, Pauline. I wanted to ask a question. So when you were doing your research, were you looking at cell phones data that is registered under older people, or were you like doing the research like in person? So can I please understand how the research and the findings were collected?
Yeah. So I used data from the Afrobarometer. So I didn't ask the questions myself. The Afrobarometer is an organization that does survey across Africa in many countries, and they send people in person into to ask directly. So the way it works, the person who asks the questions has a list of places they need to visit, and they will randomly select a household. They'll knock on the door. They'll ask to speak to one person that's above 18-year-olds, and they know if they need to speak to a man or to a woman. And then they will ask them questions, and the questions they ask that I use is, how often do you get the news from social media? So it's not based on cell phone data, and the person is expected to answer based on how often they do that, not based on whether they own a mobile phone or whether they have their own phone to get social media, for example. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any more questions? I think we should have a few more questions in the class. Yes. Go ahead.
Hi, Pauline. I just wanted to ask that, considering that the youth seem to be rebellious, as you highlighted in your research, in terms of finding alternative ways to access information on the internet or social media, do you think that over time that it would be more difficult to censor the information that is produced on social media, or will there be some sort of adaptation that happens in censoring strategies, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I think what we see, it's more and more strategic censorship forms, and it's the ones that maybe work more as well. So the old way of doing censorship is what Uganda did in 21 for the elections, for example, is shutting down all access to social media. And this led to a lot of backlash, a bit like this paper found. And it also means that if you really want to be effective, you should try to not be seen so much as doing it. So that's what I would answer to your question. But it's also something that needs more research in a way. Because as I found with this paper, I was surprised to see that it seems people are aware of online surveillance. I mean, I was quite surprised to see such a strong level of awareness. I expected less because it's supposed to be basically covered and hidden. So yeah.
As you said.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think she already touched on what I wanted to ask, because I wanted to ask that people know that they are being watched in social media. So why do they keep using it even though they know that there is some level of surveillance in social media? That's what I wanted.
Yeah. So from the data, I find that when there is surveillance, they use it a bit less, which is what you say. And now I would really like future research. I think would be very interested to understand how much people think they are being surveilled or monitored online and how they react to this. And what do they do against it? And one way would be, I'd be really interested to understand that. Because one way would be to use a pseudonym and not your own name and have like these hidden pages. But I mean, you saw I gave you my Twitter account at the end of the PowerPoint. So in the end, it's a bit.
Thank you.
So it's a good question that would need research.
Yeah, I think maybe to follow up with that, Pauline. I mean, of course, I think it's because you are making use of the Afrobarometer data, but I was just thinking maybe from some of your interactions, because I know that you also maybe not for this paper, but for your work, you also talk to young people. Are there any ways in which some of these young people are trying to bypass or trying to subvert this kind of surveillance that they are subjected to? Especially knowing that probably there are some people that are doing some surveillance on them, and what are the possible implications of having this kind of surveillance on the political activities of young people? Maybe I'm asking this because based on some of the work that I've done, sometimes people are actually not being watched, but what the authoritarian regimes do is they create an atmosphere where people feel like they're being watched and they are being listened to. They invest in that kind, in imparting that kind of culture, maybe just for a year, and then all the other years, people sort of imbibe or have that kind of belief that they are being watched, but maybe the state is not even necessarily watching. So I think I just wanted your thinking around that.
Yeah, it's a good. It's an important question, and a question people forget often. But it's really this panopticon question, right?
Yeah.
Where the state makes you believe you're being watched, and this way you don't act the same. You don't do what you would normally do, and you don't. And the state doesn't need to really be watching for you to behave better, or I mean better, according to what the state wants you to be doing. But we see quite a lot of many different types of strategies used to avoid surveillance or to bypass it or to adapt. And I was saying about using pseudonyms, and I gave X as an example, which is a bad example because it's still public data and you're still in public. But from my work, I heard some people moved to different types of apps and use more like WhatsApp and encrypted services, and also smaller groups, because a big group doesn't really mean, if you use a very big WhatsApp group, you don't know everyone on the group. So they would also use like smaller groups of chosen individuals and maybe do more things in the end offline than online, and hop from service to service, not stay only using one specific group or one specific app. But I really think it's an area that needs more research.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Yes. Go ahead.
Yes. So thank you very much. I'm more interested in the comparative perspective. Why is the important subject in this study or also the study, particularly in Africa, where Africa is a predominantly youth continent? It's a youthful continent. Why a comparative study will be important to be used? The comparative perspective will be used in this context of Africa with this youthful.
Yeah, I think so. For this paper, I think it's important to use this comparative perspective, young citizens with older citizens. And in large part, it's because it's a youthful continent, but where leaders are often very old, and not just in age, but also in the time they've sat in power. So I think it's one of the reasons I find it extremely interesting and also important. It's because you have this discrepancy of very youthful population led by very old people. And so I was really interested to see, is there any, in this, ideally you would want the majority to have a say in state affairs. And when the majority is young, but the leadership is old, there is a discrepancy. And that's why I thought it was really important to do this comparative work between young and old. I think another thing that would be interesting to do is to do comparative work beyond Africa. So compare other continents together, because then we would maybe also learn something about the difference between countries that have large young populations and countries that have large old populations. That could be another way of looking at it.
Yeah. You have a follow-up? Is it a follow-up or?
No, it's not a follow-up.
Okay.
It's the last question.
All right. Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm just curious on the profiles of participants who that you found on the Afro barometer. To what extent does education play in that?
It's a good, yeah. So the way It's quite interesting because the people who respond to the Afrobarometer, only 15% are post-secondary school. So in terms of education, it shows that it's a sample that's supposed to, so the people in the Afrobarometer, they are representative of the people in their countries. So if you have for example, if you have a large youth population in a country, the young people should be represented in the same proportion in the Afrobarometer. And it's the same with education. So they are educated, but they are not. They don't usually have university education. As for a majority, they don't have that. If that's the question you were asking. But so they don't. It's not mostly people with education who answer. It's supposed to be representative of the level of education of the people in each country.
Yeah, do you have any more questions? I think we should have a few more questions that you guys have prepared. Maybe just a generic one for the benefit of the class that I'm teaching on methods. You talked about two hypotheses that you tested with the data. I just wanted maybe if you can reflect a little bit in terms of the thinking around those two hypotheses that you developed. I'm sure maybe one or two of these guys would also probably want to have that in some of the work that they are doing, the thinking about how you develop the hypothesis and then tested that data.
So basically, what I was really interested at the start of the paper, I was really interested in censorship generally speaking. So how different states control online activities differently. And I wanted to, and I was very inspired by a couple of articles that were looking at very specific tiny examples. So one of the ones I was really interested in studied the effect of arresting very famous activists in Saudi Arabia on what others were doing online. But I also knew I couldn't do the same study because I didn't have access at the time. And it takes a lot of different methods and you need money to get access to data, and it was a big limitation. So I was very inspired by these studies, and that led me to think about the effect of censorship and to really wonder, okay, we have these tiny studies that say it leads to backlash or it leads to chilling effects. How would I check whether this finding travels beyond the specific case they study? That was one aspect. And that's how I had this hypothesis about backlash and chilling effect. And on the other hand, I'd also read a lot of literature on social media and politics in different African countries and across the world that were very, very optimistic about how social media will lead to more democracy for everyone, basically. And so I was also wondering, but what do people use social media for? And what's the effect of censorship on this? And that's how I started really digging into what would it look like if there is a backlash effect, and what would it look like if there is a chilling effect. And then when you want to know what people think across Africa, you use the Afrobarometer. And across Europe, you would use the Eurobarometer, actually. There is a similar survey in Europe. And so I looked at this survey, and that's where I found the question about using social media for news. And so I was putting together these literature on censorship and backlash effect. And then I read the literature on social media and political information and youth to see how it would connect together. And then I suggest connecting it this way, but maybe a different researcher would connect it differently. But that's how I came to this hypothesis. It was because there is this expectation that a shutdown is a very big way of censoring that also is very collective as an experience. And therefore, that's how I came to, you should expect people to use social media more when there is a shutdown, because First, because it's a low-cost way of doing it, in a sense, not in the money sense, but in the sense that it's unlikely that a single individual for using social media will face big problems for just getting the news, not for sharing and talking, but just for looking at it. So that's how I had this first hypothesis. And then I was thinking about how everyone expects the youth to be more rebellious and more active and more protesting. And that's how I went to this second hypothesis.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's very, very helpful. Yeah, we have 6 minutes. So I think we can take maybe 2 or 3 questions online if there are any questions, but also here in class. Yes, Melania, I see your hand.
When you were mentioning about the different use people use social media for, can you please give us examples of what people use social media for, like for different ages?
From different ages. So it's quite interesting because I think that's also an area where there is a lot of research that could be done. Of course, there is, there is using social media for entertainment. And when I suggest for, chatting with friends, finding memes, sharing cute videos, stuff like that. And then there are all of these more sociological studies that I'm not a sociologist, so it's a bit of I've read some, but I'm not an expert on that. But you have these really interesting studies about how it's also used to create a group and an identity and to find like-minded people and develop these types of like creative, using social media as a way to really build a group of friends, for example, or if you're isolated, find community. So that's an interesting thing. But there is a book about older people using social media, but I have to admit I haven't read it. So I wouldn't be able to give you direct examples of that. But it's a reference by Miller and colleagues about social media and older people.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think we are only left with about 4 minutes, and I think those 4 minutes we can use them to thank you, Pauline, for agreeing to share your insights and presenting to us. And I think we really appreciate that. It's very important. So most of the people that are online, of course, I know there are some colleagues, but there are also some of my students that are invited, some of them second year. Actually, Melania, I'm so proud that she's actually second year, but she's she was very active. That shows how fascinating the work is. So thank you very much, Pauline, for gracing us today and sharing your ideas with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and for your questions. It was also very interesting for me.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of your day. And those online as well, thank you very much for attending. We are going to be having these weekly seminars every Tuesday. And you are free to attend. So thank you very much online for joining us. I think it's a sizable number, 17 online and almost 16 here. So it's a good number for our third seminar series. Okay, thank you very much, Pauline. Enjoy the rest of the day, and pass my regards to colleagues at CMI.
I will. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Right, those online, thank you very much for attending our session today. And we look forward to having you again next week for our next sociology seminar series.